right, just admitting the last few folks. All right, so hello everyone. Welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Hope everyone can hear me all right. Thank you for joining us, and a big thank you to our sponsor, the Japan Foundation New York, for funding this series and enabling us to put this on each week. Obviously, my name is Jeff Mazziata, a little bit of a different face. You're probably used to Amani. However, Amani is preparing for her wedding, so I want to send a congratulations to Amani, and I hope her wedding is going well. So besides myself, we are also joined today by Dr. Paul Midford, Midford, who will be presenting on Japan's role in efforts to combat climate change. Dr. Midford is Professor of International Relations at Meiji Gakuin University in Yokohama, Japan, and he specializes in Japanese foreign and security policies, renewable energy policies, politics and policy, as well as East Asian regional politics and security. He's published in an international organization, International Studies Quarterly, Security Studies, the Pacific Review, and numerous other publications. He's also the author of Rethinking Japanese Public Opinion and Security, From Pacifism to Realism. And of course, co-editor on various other books, and essentially an extremely prolific writer. And if you would like to get more details, you can see the full bio on our website. So Dr. Midford, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule. If it's okay with you, I will hand it over to you and let you take it from here.
Okay, well, thank you, Jeff, for that very kind introduction and for inviting me here today. It's a great pleasure and honor to speak to YCAPS. Actually, I spoke in person back in 2019 about my earlier book on Japan's leadership in regional security multilateralism, which is my other main area. So, but as I said, today I'm going to talk about Japan's role and its efforts in combating climate change. So, as kind of introduce everybody to Japan's policies and roles in this area, and I look forward to any questions you might have after my presentation. So just to give you a brief overview, so I'll mention a little bit about global warming in Japan, and this will be a fairly basic presentation, but again, I'm happy to take more detailed questions later. Then I'll talk about Japan and the Kyoto Protocol, the subsequent fading of Japan's global leadership on climate change mitigation talks, and then the next landmark global accord after Kyoto, which was the Paris Accords, and then what Japan has been doing in terms of making commitments to reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. We'll talk about President Suga's kind of upping of Japan's targets and ambition in 2 years ago in 2021. And then we're going to look at some of the challenges that Japan faces in meeting its new greenhouse gas reduction goals, particularly its goals for promoting renewable energy. So that's going to be basically the whole contents of my talk. So just to talk about global warming briefly, although there is a debate in the US, as I think we all know, about whether human-caused global warming is real, I want to emphasize there's no real significant debate in Japan about the reality of global warming. Public opinion shows that most Japanese see this as a threat, and certainly the Japanese government thinks so as well. So does the conservative Liberal Democratic Party. So there's no debate about that in Japan, noticeable debate. However, there is a real debate here about how urgent a threat global warming is and how best to respond. So just to be clear, this presentation is not about climate change itself, but it's about how Japan's policies that it pursued to cooperate in efforts to combat climate change by reducing greenhouse gases, and its efforts now to eventually achieve net carbon neutrality, which in Japan just anticipates set a goal of doing so by approximately 2050. So first, let's talk about Japan and the Kyoto Protocol. First we have the 1990 Rio Summit, of course, the so-called Earth Summit, that was the first major international conference to begin to address the issue of carbon dioxide and other global greenhouse gas emissions and how they were leading to global warming. And so building on that, Japan hosted COP3. By the way, COP3 stands for Conference of Parties. So parties to essentially the Rio Agreement and those who joined later for cooperating to reduce greenhouse gases and stabilize the climate. So the Kyoto Agreement, the Kyoto Protocol is really important because it's the first one to produce, it produced the first binding promise by developed and newly industrializing countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions below 1990 levels by an average of around 5%, somewhat more for the developed countries, somewhat less for the industrializing countries. It also identified, besides carbon dioxide, some other greenhouse gases such as chlorofluorocarbons, methane, etc. I won't. I would add that, you know, a 5% reduction compared to 1990 levels seems pretty modest by today's standards. At the Rio summit, there was an attempt or talk about at least stemming the increase. And of course, actually, despite these efforts, we have continued to see greenhouse gas emissions globally rising since then. But in any case, so the industrialized countries, the newly industrializing countries, at least agreed to make cuts of 5%. This is a binding treaty, a binding protocol. However, developing countries, especially China and India, but others as well in Africa and elsewhere, had no obligations under this agreement. And they argued that reductions, if they were forced to make significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions while they were still just starting to develop, this would really hurt their development and hurt their economic progress. And they, you know, were arguing essentially that they should have some, you know, leeway to develop first, because the developed countries of today all were heavy emitters of greenhouse gas and gases, CO2, when they were developing. Now, because it was branded with the name Kyoto, this gave Japan an incentive to, at least initially, be very active in promoting adherence to the agreement, which Japan did. Again, it was brand Kyoto is really brand Japan. So Japan saw this as very much part of its kind of national, that its reputation was at stake with this agreement. So, but the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactor meltdowns contributed to a fading of Japan's global leadership in these climate change talks. Actually, it started even before then. It's important to note, just to step back and note that Japan is really very energy insecure. It imports currently over 85% of its primary energy needs, and in the past it was over 90%. Japan has relied on, frankly, U.S. hegemony, U.S. kind of, strength as a dominant power during the Cold War to ensure stable energy imports, particularly from the Middle East. So Japan in the 1950s kind of moved away from coal. Japan used to have its own coal industry, actually. If you go down to Nagasaki, there's this place called Gunkan Shima, which is an island that looks like a battleship that was actually a coal mine. But in the 50s and 60s, Japan shut down its coal industry and became very oil dependent. And this worked out fine until the 1973 Arab oil embargo and the emergence of OPEC as a cartel that could set prices for oil. And so Japan, as a result of the Arab oil embargo, which hit Japan pretty hard, decided it needed to change its policies and could not rely on these oil imports to have energy security. So from 1973, Japan turned to nuclear energy to enhance energy security and autonomy after 1973. I won't go into too much detail. Japan had actually already started to embrace nuclear power as early as the mid-1950s. Nakasone Yasuhiro, who later becomes prime minister, was writing in the 1950s, Japan needed civilian nuclear power to be a major power. If it didn't have it, it would not even be a third-rate power, according to him. Japan opened its first commercial reactor in 1966. And Japan even committed to a so-called closed fuel cycle, which was the idea that they would take uranium that had been used in a reactor, reprocess it as plutonium, and even use breeder reactors that would create even more plutonium, so that they could even become independent of uranium imports. So Japan had a very ambitious nuclear program, and the only country actually outside of the nuclear weapon states that had plans for a closed nuclear fuel cycle involving reprocessing plutonium. However, there were a series of nuclear accidents brought nuclear expansion to a halt by the late 1990s. You've all heard of the Fukushima Daiichi accident. You might not have heard of another one called the Tokaimura accident in 1999, actually at a fuel processing plant that led to, I believe it was 2 workers dying, several being injured by high radiation exposure and the local release of radiation. And after that, Japan's rapid expansion of nuclear power basically came to an end. And that caused Japan to become more passive in global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because one of Japan's main means for reducing its own emissions was expanding nuclear power. And Japan had very ambitious goals for that. By the time of the Tokaimura accident, Japan was generating about 30% of its electricity from nuclear power, and there had been proposals to expand that to 40%, 50%, and up and up. But even actually before Tokaimura, and especially after it, these goals tended to be missed due to growing local opposition, and safety concerns about nuclear power became increasingly hard to build nuclear power plants. And so this all contributed to Japan becoming more passive. Now, Japan also, the government tried to argue that nuclear power wasn't just useful for nuclear energy security, but also useful for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But certainly by the mid-2000s, the middle of the first decade of this century, Japan was becoming more passive. Now, one partial exception is that when Prime Minister Abe Shinzo was in office for the first time in 2006, 2007, he made a relatively ambitious proposal, something called Cool Earth 50. And the idea was that Japan would cut its greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2050. Which again, by the standards of 2007, looks pretty ambitious. By today's standards, it does not look ambitious at all. But he made that proposal and was encouraging other countries and particularly major industrial countries to follow suit. Now, the Fukushima accident, the Fukushima Daiichi accident that resulted from the Great East Japan earthquake of March 11, 2011, that produced the earthquake and then a massive tsunami that flooded the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant and caused its cooling system to fail and 4 of its reactors to melt down. That accident very much accelerated this trend, causing Japan to abandon its second commitment period to the Kyoto Protocol, partly because after that accident, Japan basically scrapped its old safety regime, its old safety system for nuclear power as being inadequate. It shut down all of its, essentially all of its nuclear reactors, and would not allow them to restart until they met the new, far stricter safety requirements that were enacted by a new agency called the Nuclear Regulatory Authority, NRA. And that's still going on. Japan had 54 reactors before the Fukushima accident. The Fukushima Daiichi accident took 6 of them out. And since then, another 14 have been slated for being decommissioned and scrapped because they're too old to meet the new safety requirements. So at most, Japan has 34 can restart. So far, it's restarted about 9 or 10. It's a very slow and expensive process because the NRA has been very strict about its safety standards. And the Liberal Democratic Party under Prime Minister Abe have tried to gain public acceptance for nuclear power by saying that it is Japan is building the safest nuclear power system in the world. And that makes it hard for them to kind of pressure the NRA, which is a very independent agency, to loosen any of these new very strict standards. So now let's move ahead to the Paris Agreement on the Paris Accord on climate change mitigation, or climate change efforts to reduce and if not reversed climate change and global warming. This was signed in December 2015. And by the way, this agreement and the Kyoto agreements, these are signed by, you know, the vast majority of countries, well over 180 countries. So this is these are pretty much universal agreements, even if not everybody ratifies them. Like, for example, as you may know, the United States signed the Paris Accord, but has not ratified it. Now, for the first time, the Paris Accord is different from the Kyoto Accord because for the first time, it commits the signatories, it commits not only the developed countries and the newly industrializing countries, but also developing countries, i.e. China, India, developing countries in Africa and Asia, to greenhouse gas reductions. They have to each country has to set greenhouse gas reduction targets and report on them regularly and update and strengthen them regularly. Also, the Paris Accord created a finance mechanism for mandating mandated a finance mechanism for funding decarbonization in developing countries. This includes things such as a carbon tax on carbon emissions by, say, big factories, also carbon offsets. I don't know how many of you know what a carbon offset is. It's not something very, I think, widely used in the United States or even in Japan. But when you fly in Europe, part of the price of your ticket is a carbon offset. It's essentially a tax on the amount of carbon you produce by flying in an airplane. And these funds are supposed to be used to fund renewable energy and other decarbonization projects in developing countries. Now, the Paris Accord sets the goal of keeping average global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius. As of 2015, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, average temperatures globally had already risen by 1.2 degrees Celsius. And the Paris Accord wants to keep them below 1.5 or at least below 2, which is seen as a real tipping point. There was a new study recently that said the world may hit 1.5 as soon as 2027. Also, I won't go into too much detail about this, but this is, of course, related to increasing carbon dioxide emission levels in the atmosphere. Before the 20th century, they'd never been above 300 parts per million. In 1959, they were measured at 312 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And as of 2019, concentrations had reached 419, with some estimates that they might reach 500 by 2050 if nothing is done. Now, Japan did not play a noticeable leadership role in negotiating this agreement, but it has consistently supported it. So, and as part of the Paris Agreement, the Paris Accords, the Abe administration, the second Abe administration, made its own commitment, which wasn't that ambitious, but certainly compared to Europe, but it was a serious target. So in 2015, Japan announced that its intended nationally determined contribution, INDC, which every country has to release, has to declare, would be a 26% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions for 2030 below 2013 levels. Now, by comparison, EU countries announced a 40% reduction target for 2013 in these emissions below 1990 levels. Now, using the same 1990 baseline as the EU, Japan's commitment amounted to only an 18% reduction. So in short, the Abe administration's target was not as ambitious as, and Japan was arguably lagging at least behind Europe. Now, why did Japan use 2013 instead of 1990, which had been the target used before? After the Fukushima Daiichi accident, Japan shut down all its nuclear plants, as I said, and greenhouse gas emissions for Japan shot up in 2011 and 2012. Interestingly, they peaked in 2013. And in 2014, even before any new reactors had been and before any nuclear reactors were turned back down, Japan's greenhouse gas emissions were already falling. But in any case, that is the baseline that Japan set for its greenhouse gas reductions targets, 2013, not because that's when they peaked most recently, not 1990. So those were the targets for the Abe administration, which were not considered very ambitious, certainly, again, compared to Europe. Now, later, the Suga administration moved for more ambitious reduction targets. Now, to be sure, domestically, there have been pressure for Japan to raise the targets. In February 2020, there was a coalition of Japanese environmental non-governmental organizations, NGOs, something called the Climate Action Network, and they called for the Abe administration to raise Japan's greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. The Abe administration responded by refusing. However, a little more than a year later, Prime Minister Suga, who succeeded Prime Minister Abe, decided to raise Japan's greenhouse gas reduction targets for 2030 to 46% compared to 2013. And they pledged 100% reduction by 2050. The EU target for greenhouse gas emissions by comparison was 55%, but still, this was a much bigger and more ambitious target. And also the target of 100% reduction by 2050, which basically means net carbon neutrality, which is what the EU and the US and other countries, developed countries, were committing to. China, by comparison, I think India actually committed to pretty similar goals, but their goal for they promised carbon neutrality by 2060, so 10 years later. As part of the Suga decided to raise the renewable energy target for electricity production in Japan from 36 to 38%, up to 36 to 38% by 2030. Now, the previous target that the Abe administration had set for 2030 was that renewable energy, mostly wind and solar, but also geothermal and biofuels, the previous target had been only 22 to 24%, which was much more so than, say, 10, 15 years ago, when it had been more like 1 or 2%. But still, compared to many other countries, this seemed pretty low. And in fact, already as of this year, the share of renewable energy in Japan's electricity production already exceeds 22%. So this was not a very ambitious target. But the new target that Suga announced is quite ambitious, and it was controversial. The Ministry of Economics, Trade, and Industry even argued it would be hard to meet, and they argued for a target more like 30%. Others argue still that 36 to 38% is too low. A well-known renewable energy institute in Tokyo has put out a detailed plan for how Japan could generate 45% from renewables. And of course, renewables, as we know, do not, or maybe we don't, but I'll make clear, they generally do not produce any greenhouse gas emissions or any other pollutions, wind or solar. And so they're very useful for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, nuclear power's share of the energy mix has been left at 20 to 22%. There's been, in the recent year or so, particularly under Prime Minister Kishida in the last 2 years, efforts to try to accelerate the restart of nuclear power plants. That hasn't really gone anywhere, though. And many experts think Japan will fall short of its goals, and it's unlikely that nuclear power will generate more than 15% of Japan's electricity in 2030. Now, Suga's new targets also means that 15 gigawatts, a large worth of new coal-fired plants that were generating electricity using coal, are being scrapped. After the Fukushima Daiichi accident, the Japanese government announced to fill the gap left by nuclear power, they're going to build a lot of new coal-fired plants. This created a lot of controversy, but now they've decided not to do that. And in fact, the plan now is to reduce coal usage from 26 to 19% of generation. So, and in fact, Prime Minister Suga went as far as to turn these decarbonization targets into law. So he enacted a law in June 2021, Japan's climate change law, that set very clear targets for how much Japan was going to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. It focused on things like electrification of transportation, promoting the use of hydrogen. I would add Japan has been the first country to announce under the Abe administration a national hydrogen strategy for using hydrogen as a fuel, as an energy carrier, and as a replacement for other things like natural gas. Hydrogen can be made from clean renewable energy. And it calls for Japan to become a hydrogen economy by 2050. So also hydrogen economy or hydrogen society. Though this law also calls for, as it says, reestablishing nuclear energy policy and reducing thermal energy, again, coal, oil, natural gas plants for generating electricity as much as possible. There are other things they have to do, like most of Japan's steel plants still use coal instead of electricity to make steel. That produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. They need to switch to electric furnaces instead. Okay, so these are the national targets. I won't spend too much time on them, but as you can see, the EU is the most ambitious, and Germany, France, the UK. Britain is also very ambitious. California, New York also are too. The US a little bit less overall, but still actually a bit more, even nationally under the Biden administration, a bit more ambitious than Japan. Now, it's important to note that half of Japan's greenhouse gas emissions come from only about 130 facilities, mostly factories, mostly electric power plants and some steel mills. That's most of where it comes from. You can see the top 10 here. Again, steel factories and coal-fired electricity plants make them up entirely. And obviously households are part of the story too, other businesses, etc. But this is the bulk of it. So switching to renewable energy and closing coal plants will make a big difference. Now, why did the Suga administration decide to adopt these more ambitious targets? Perhaps foreign pressure can explain part of Prime Minister Suga's decision. Japan faced international reputational pressures. A lot of environmental NGOs have resorted to the naming and shaming tactics. And as you can see here, Japan was actually has been awarded at least twice the fossil fuel or the Fossil of the Week award. These are usually given out at these COP conferences. So Japan, you can see there, along with Brazil, got these awards for continuing to stick to coal and not giving any. Japan has not yet said when it will give up coal altogether, even though it is phasing it out. Also, on the other hand, you have domestic supporters of ambitious targets, such as the Ministry of Environment. Environmental NGOs, although as we saw, they're not very strong or influential in Japan. And some industries, eco industries, arguably pressured the Suga administration to be more ambitious. And there's also a desire not to fall behind, too far behind the US and especially Europe in greenhouse gas reduction targets. Japan wants to keep up with its peers in the G7 and the industrialized democracies. Now, other reasons why Suga adopted these more ambitious targets, there's this thing called the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So among corporations, you've had divestment and climate risk disclosure movements. You've had $14 trillion US dollars worth of endowments and portfolios have divested in part or entirely from fossil fuel investments. So they no longer invest or put money into coal-fired electricity plants or oil-fired plants, etc. Now, many Japanese companies have joined this international coal market investment, although some have been relatively slow. Recently, Japan's major banks have been saying they will no longer invest in facilities that generate large greenhouse gas emissions. Large plants. Now, most big Japanese companies have also become members of this UN TCFD, which involves making financial disclosures about investments and assets they own that are major emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. Then, and this is perhaps even more significant, we have this thing called RE100, which is a corporate movement, a global corporate movement to switch to 100% renewable energy. That also influences Japan's Japanese companies' behaviors. So major corporations like Apple, Microsoft, Siemens, Mercedes, etc., are telling their suppliers they must switch to 100% renewable electricity by 2030 or potentially lose contracts. So this pressures Japanese suppliers and by extension the Japanese government to accelerate the switch to renewables. Now, also domestically, we can see some reasons for these new targets. Domestic politics plays a role too. The proposals for these new ambitious targets were backed by an intra-cabinet coalition. So people in Prime Minister Suga's cabinet, including Kono Taro, who was then the Minister of for Administrative Reform. He's now the Digital Minister, and Koizumi Shinjiro, the son of the former Prime Minister, very famous Prime Minister 20 years ago. He was then serving as Environmental Minister. Interestingly, both represent the region here of Kanagawa, and Koizumi represents Yokosuka, where, of course, we have the US base. Now, Kono and Koizumi have acted more generally to promote renewable energy. Kono has been an outspoken critic of nuclear power. And I should say, these are both members of the conservative ruling LDP party. So there are some in the LDP who do want to promote renewables and who are skeptical about nuclear power. So they've promoted renewable energy. They've moved to scrap coal expansion plans and coal-fired plants and increase the ambition of Japan's greenhouse gas reductions targets. So coal expansion was a particularly big controversy and flashpoint back in 2021. And they essentially sidelined Japan's industry ministry METI on these issues. Also, when Suga came into office, he signed a new coalition agreement, cabinet agreement with his coalition partner, Komeito. So Komeito has been a long-term coalition partner of the LDP in government. And one policy platform that was in that coalition agreement was to accelerate climate change policy, and by which presumably also means upping Japan's greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets. Well, there you can see pictures of Kono on the left and Koizumi on the right. So under Prime Minister Kishida, he inherited Prime Minister Suga's ambitious targets, but the policy direction has been a little less clear. He has expressed more support for bringing back nuclear power. There's a new push for modular nuclear reactors within the LDP, yet there are no concrete plans for siting and constructing such reactors or building any new reactors, except for a few that have been under construction since before 2011, so for like 15 or 20 years. And the fact it's taking that long tells you it's very hard. It's a very slow, laborious, difficult process to build nuclear power plants in Japan due to a lot of court challenges and other challenges. So while renewable energy in Japan is expanding rapidly, nuclear power is at best, at the most optimistic scenario, would be very slow expansion, which is why it's hard to see it as being a major part of Japan, playing a very big role in Japan's ambitions to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions. There's been some liberalization of the rules for how long these plants can stay in operation beyond 60 years, etc. Now, Japan has been sort of making up for this by, for example, or Kishida has been making up for this by proposing an Asia Zero Emissions Community proposal to help other Asian nations reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. This involves Japan providing money to other Asian countries, particularly poor countries, to help them fund renewable energy and other projects. Also, there's an emphasis on promoting offshore wind, which is an area where Japan is very big. Just briefly, Japan has the potential to, according to the International Energy Agency and Japan's own Environment Ministry, if Japan has recoverable, practical wind resources offshore, such that it could generate 9 times Japan's total electricity demand. So you sometimes hear stories about, well, Japan doesn't have much, is energy poor, or doesn't have much in the way of renewable energy resources. That is simply not true. Japan could produce, up, according to these estimates, up to 9 times as much electricity as it currently uses. So it has great potential if it develops it. And this is also true for the European Union, the United States, India, not so much China, which is ironic because today China has moved ahead of the UK as the world, as the country that has the most offshore wind. So you can see the share of renewables in Japan's energy mix has been steadily increasing. It's now up to 22%. And solar has been the big growth sector. Solar has now overtaken hydro as the main renewable energy source for electricity. It's now, solar alone is now over 10% of Japan's energy mix. So a couple of challenges Japan's facing, finally, lagging electrification of its transportation sector, except for trains. Even though Nissan beat Tesla to the market with its first mass-produced battery-powered electric vehicle, or BEV, the Nissan Leaf, Japan and even Nissan now lag far behind. Toyota bet very heavily on hydrogen fuel cell technology, FCEVs, but that technology and infrastructure have really lagged behind the BEVs. And at the same time, Japan plans to phase out gasoline passenger car sales by 2035, but hybrids will not be phased out, and that's different from the US, Europe, and many other places. Japan faces a challenge of realizing its greenhouse gas reduction goals in terms of its lack of a national electricity grid that limits its ability to, or makes it harder to adopt renewable energy. Japan has 2 different electricity standards. Maybe many of you don't even know that. Many Japanese don't know this. Here in Eastern Japan, we use 50 hertz. In Western Japan, 60 hertz, and that means it's very hard to send power between the 2 regions. You can, but you have to use converters, and they waste a lot of energy. Japan also has no tie lines with South Korea or other neighbors, unlike, say, European countries or the US. And if Japan built electricity lines to South Korea and other countries, these could be used to integrate more renewable energy into the grid. There's even a proposal for a super grid linking Japan, Korea, Russia, China, Southeast Asia, Taiwan. Obviously, there's some political concerns about that we can talk about, but that's a proposal. And then third, Japan has a need for more electricity storage. This is probably one of the biggest issues, and especially grid batteries. Japan has the world's 2nd largest pump hydro storage, which means you use electricity to pump water up to a dam on top of a mountain to store it, and then when you need the electricity, you run it back down. It used to be #1, but China just overtook Japan in that. But so Japan has that, but it needs a regulatory framework for grid battery storage companies so that they can become a viable business. Because of a lack of grid capacity and storage, a lot of Japan's renewable energy, particularly in Kyushu, a good percentage of it gets curtailed or cut off from the grid because there's just too much solar power coming onto the grid and the grid can't handle it. Again, most of that is in Kyushu. So a way to stop wasting all that renewable energy is to rapidly build up storage, grid storage, particularly batteries, but other forms of storage as well. And I'll end it there. Thank you very much for listening. I think I went a bit over time, but I look forward to your questions.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Midford. I'm just going to end your screen share really quickly.
Sure.
If you'd like, if you like, we can go back to using it for the Q&A as well. If questions come up and you'd like to, feel free. But yes, we're about to get into the Q&A. So again, I want to mention we've got a few questions, but there's always room for more. So anyone has more, please feel free to put them in the chat. But that being said, we're going to be moving into the Q&A session. I wanted to start off, I have a particular question I was thinking about when you mentioned the immense potential that Japan has for offshore wind at 9 times of what it currently uses as a nation. I was curious about, well, what's preventing that? Is it just the transportability issue? Is it cost? Could you go into a little bit more about, that sounds great. Why aren't we doing it? What are the limitations?
Well, Japan is starting to do it. The Kishida administration in particular is now emphasizing it. We just had Japan's first large scale offshore wind farm open off of Akita in December last year. So it's starting to happen. Japan is now, there are two major types of offshore. There's kind of the fixed offshore, in which you embed the tower for the wind turbine in the seabed, and then there's floating, where you tether it with cables to the seabed. And the potential for floating is much bigger. Floating is a newer technology. It's more expensive, but in the longer run, it should actually be a lot easier, because you can basically make these things in port and then tow them out, deploy them. If they need to be repaired, you can tow them back to port. But those are already used a lot off. Britain uses floating offshore a lot, and also fixed offshore, and so does China. So, but it is a bit more expensive. The prices are coming down, but it's more expensive. But in terms of why Japan isn't doing more of this, I guess because Japan has been a little bit slower in general, policy making moves more slowly. Also there's some political interests. Local fisheries associations have had a lot of power in Japan. And for example, when they set up a floating wind turbine off of Fukushima, there was some objection to that. Actually, that's now been taken down. That was experimental. But so they have to often overcome opposition from powerful fishing cooperatives. That's one issue. But in terms of like practicality, it's obviously you have to like run cables to the coast, and so you have some long distances. But if you compare the distances to, say, like the Fukushima plant to Tokyo, it's not necessarily, it's pretty comparable. The other thing is, I mean, we're talking about a massive multi-decade kind of project. We're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of wind turbines. I mean, we're already starting to see that scale off of China and off of the UK, but it takes a long time. But the goal now is 10 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030 and 45 by 2040. And I think China now is right now just over 20 to put it in scale. But it's just been a kind of a slow moving, the politics can be kind of slow moving. Again, you have interests who are more interested in nuclear power and hope that might be the way forward. But the government now is really interested in offshore wind. There's no doubt about that.
Okay.
That ends.
Mentioning the various political hurdles, keeping that in mind, also we have the populace. You mentioned the targets for the new administration. Obviously, for I think many of us, we feel like renewable energy is great. We have to, get these greenhouse gases down. But some people might look at the idea of a offshore wind turbine as ruining their beautiful sea view, and other things like that. How is the Japanese population taking these goals? Do you see any pushback, or does it seem like most people are quite encouraging towards reaching these new goals, even if it takes ruining their beautiful sea views or other potential headaches?
Right. Well, if you have near offshore wind and you have fixed bottom wind turbines, those can be an eyesore because they're close enough to see. But particularly if you go further out and if you go to floating, you can't see it from shore. It's too far away. So that's one answer to it. By going further out, also when you go further out, you get steadier, stronger winds. So there's an advantage to building further out. But there hasn't been a lot of that. One way they've been getting around this is a lot of these have been built near ports, which are not exactly scenic anyway. There was also another issue in Akita. Apparently, the wind turbines there were actually interfering with TV signals. Some people there receive their TV by rabbit ears or whatever antennas, and that was causing some interference. And that was widely reported. On the other hand, it's pretty easy to fix. They just boosted and changed the signal, and the problem went away. Also, the Defense Ministry complained last year that some wind turbines may be interfering with their radars, which was another issue. And they said that in 1 or 2 cases, they'd asked that some wind farms be moved. But I don't think that's a general problem. I think that's a very localized problem. And, it also kind of raises some interesting questions. If it does interfere with radars, maybe it could be kind of a defensive screen on the other hand. And, you also wonder about China. I mean, they have a massive build out of offshore wind. And is this a problem for them or an advantage? I don't know in terms of what it does to radars, but that's another consideration. But so far, that's not been a major factor, I think.
Hmm, interesting. Well, I just figured I would bring up the civilian side of things with the wind, but I mean, just in general, I was curious how the population was taking it. But let's move on. We had a few questions in the chat, and a bit of discussion in the chat early on when we were obviously talking about nuclear. There were some questions regarding the lifespan of nuclear reactors and shifting targets and numbers on, well, is it a 30-year? Is it a 60-year? Where does our knowledgeable speakers stand on these? So could you talk a little bit more about lifespans of nuclear reactors? And are this supposed 60-year lifespan feasible, or is that something we should be looking at?
Well, I should add that the expansion of renewable energy and also the new regime for nuclear power was all put in place by the Democratic Party of Japan when they were in power in 2012. And when they established the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, they also set a rule that nuclear power plants can only operate for 40 years. But in exceptional circumstances, if they get permission, they can operate for 60. Now, in practice, since that time, the NRA has mostly been granting requests for extension to 60, but 60 was a hard limit. Now, the change this year, which is portrayed in the press as a big retreat from that, actually it's not a very big retreat. There are all these reactors have been shut down for years, waiting to be approved, get approval from the NRA. And what the new law says is those periods no longer count towards the 60 years. So if you're shut down for 5 years, you can operate until 65 years. Now, and there are some advocates say, heck, you can operate for 80 years. I'm skeptical about that, but certainly 60 years, it seems not that unusual compared to other countries. Now, the NRA actually, which is very independent and very strong, critics thought it would be, captured by industry and be very weak. It's actually been very strong, much stronger than its predecessor. They actually responded to this by making their rules tougher. So it used to be at 40 years, you had this big kind of review of safety review of the plant, and they would decide whether to grant it a new license for 20 years or not. So this would be a very big, serious review, and they might want them to do retrofitting. They've now moved that back to year 30. So now in year 30, you have to do this big inspection, and then every 10 years after. So they've sort of pushed back against this kind of attempt to ease the regulations. So I mean that's my take on it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Just to add some context or perspective, how does that compare to other nations' regulations around nuclear? Are Japan in a more strict position now than other countries, or is it in line with what other countries are doing?
I have to say I know much more about Japan than I do about other countries, but I think it's closer. So before the Fukushima accident, actually the International Atomic Energy Agency and the U.S. Nuclear Authority, NRC Commission, were actually criticizing Japan for being too lax, in particular, not having like waterproof pumping stations or backup systems, redundancies, that sort of things. And Japan was basically ignoring it, partly because the previous regulatory agency could advise nuclear operators to make these changes, but they couldn't order them. The NRA can and has ordered them to shut down. So for example, and they also keep coming up with new regulations. So they introduced a whole bunch of counterterrorism measures, and some plants that didn't meet them in time were ordered to shut down until they did. So they are very different from the previous authority. And I would just say, I mean, I think 60 years is not that unreasonable. 40 to 60, I think is kind of the norm. I don't know about much more. I'm not sure I'm aware of other cases much beyond that.
I appreciate that. The reason I ask is I'm sure many of us, we always worry, we aren't nuclear experts, and people are always worried since the disaster. So it's good to know that the new regulations are quite strict. Speaking of regulations and laws and enforcement of those, we had a great chat question in the chat by Vivian uh,
Uh-huh.
regarding climate change laws. So Vivian asks, when people hear law, they usually have an image of punishment for breaking the law. What are
Mm.
the punishments, in quotations, if any? Who enforces this climate change law or these, regulations, and how is it enforced? Or, as you've referenced, she mentions, is it like some of the other laws in Japan or other countries where people will just do their best?
I think it's probably more the latter. I don't think there are any punishments, and you could punish Prime Minister Suga, but he won't be in office then. Maybe not even alive. I don't know, but so yeah, I think it's more like it's a symbol of commitment and a commitment of reputation. So if Japan doesn't make it, there will be a lot of hand wringing and questions will be asked. Why did we fail to do this? Now, if there's another, heaven forbid, another big accident like a Fukushima accident or something like that, you might say, well, this thing got in the way that we couldn't anticipate, blah, blah, blah. But short of that, I think, yeah, there's a strong expectation that when you put it in law that there's some sense of obligation that you need to make it. You need to realize that. So, but we'll see.
Mm. Continuing on this conversation on the obligations and again these commitments that we're making, obviously I know that in the States I've heard this discussion as well. Ryan asked a question, taken into account. Well, he says, do they? I'm thinking he means the Paris Accord reduction commitments. Do they take into account new technologies for future nuclear expansion, such as thorium, molten salt, EPR, fusion, other things like this? Basically, are we taking into potential technological increases, and are they using that as part of their metrics when they're scaling these things out for their deductions?
Well, just to be clear, the Paris Agreement really doesn't say much about nuclear power. It's certainly not. It's not an anti-nuclear agreement at all. And many countries are saying they want to, at least in part, reach their climate change goals using nuclear power. Now, and also Paris doesn't have any specific goals for how much each country has to reduce. Rather, you have these nationally declared goals that each country has to publish regularly. It was every 5 years. I think now it's down to every 2 years. And, as new technology developments, new nuclear technology, new solar, wind, tidal, it's expected they will keep upping their ambition. So I think many countries are taking these new technologies into account. The one thing I'd say about Japan, I think this is true of many other countries too, is that nuclear power as we know it, which is relatively large, is very hard. It's very time consuming, expensive, difficult to build. So even if you want to promote nuclear power, the renewables are racing ahead much faster. So that just as a practical concern, that makes it hard to see nuclear being a big part of the picture. Although, Japan restarting some of its reactors and Germany keeping some of them open as a bridge to the time when more renewables come online, you could argue that's a very pragmatic thing to do. They're already built, they're already there. As for modular nuclear reactors, I mean, I know, of course, many of you in the military, of course, know that, we have nuclear powered aircraft carriers and submarines and that sort of thing. It's not that different a technology, but adopting it for civilian use and the regulations and figuring what to do with waste and all that is a big problem. And that's also another big problem Japan has. They have no waste disposal facilities. Obviously, the US doesn't. I think Finland is about the only country that does. So that's kind of another challenge that they have. But you're right that, if you can solve those problems, potentially nuclear could be a bigger part of the greenhouse reduction story.
Mm,
Gas reduction
very,
story.
very interesting. Um, if I could shift a little bit back into the renewables, and you mentioned carbon offsets.
Yeah,
Vivian had a question. Vivian has a lot of great questions.
good.
She asks regarding carbon offsets. What is Japan's system to ensure that carbon credits are actually derived from positive efforts, such as planting new trees, etc., rather than someone trying to derive credits from a piece of previously unregistered forest land and other kind of ways to game the system a little bit?
I'm not, I don't have that kind of detailed knowledge. I can imagine that does happen, registering a piece of land as a carbon sink when,
It's been there.
rather than planting trees, just using a pre-existing forest. Yeah, I can imagine that does happen, but I honestly don't have a lot of details about that.
Of course. Well, we have a question that just popped up in the chat from Mark Elder. He says, after
I know.
Fukushima, why did Japan choose to shift to coal? Well, this is rather than accelerate renewable energy. So this is kind of a
A great question.
yeah,
And
tough
I
one.
would disagree with the premise a little bit. They did
Yeah,
decide
great,
to
please.
accelerate renewable energy, and we saw a vast expansion.
Hmm,
Um, Coal was chosen, I think, because first of all, it was cheaper. In fact, renewables are basically now the cheapest source of electricity globally, but in Japan, coal is still cheaper due to various regulatory and other reasons that are not entirely clear, although that may change by 2025. But that was Meti's concern, and they also, I think, thought they could be built up fast. So that's my understanding for why they did this. But it is certainly, on the other hand, in reality, the coal plants took a long time to start building and planning because there's a lot of opposition. So I think it kind of failed. That plan to build coal plants, in the end, I think most of them did not get built. But that was that was their kind of go-to a quick emergency reaction to energy insecurity, because
yeah,
it's cheap and it's also the supply is secure.
relatively fast. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do want to definitely call back to your mentioning Japan's energy security issues being reliant on around 85% of foreign sources for their energy, which is quite a difficult position to be placed in.
Yeah.
So I can definitely recognize the need for something a quick solution. And so yeah, because Mark continues with, you mentioning, you citing Fukushima as one of the reasons for the reduced contribution of climate negotiations. So speaking of the speed and the ease of getting that coal online, and you mentioned the difficulty and obviously time that goes into getting nuclear. Had they shifted and not gone into coal and just tried to go that green, how long does it really take? How long would it have taken to try to recapture some of that energy production lost by turning off the nuclear facilities and trying to recapture that with a pure green push? I mean, that was probably an unfeasible expectation.
Well, maybe in the short run, although, between 2013 and 2015, Japan was zero nuclear. They had no nuclear power
Yeah.
plants. Their CO2 emissions peaked in 2013 and started going down. So they might have been able to do that actually without restarting them. I mean, I'm not necessarily saying that's a good idea, although that might have meant more coal plants staying open potentially. But
Okay.
they had this very ambitious feed-in tariff. They have the highest rate in the world for like rooftop solar, like 42 yen a kilowatt hour. That's amazingly high. I think what they could have done more was they could have pushed more vigorously to get the regional electric power companies to start building out tie lines. They could have explored, one thing they did not take seriously was this Asia supergrid proposal to start building tie lines, starting with South Korea. South Korea wanted to do this. So I think and also they've been lagging on storage. Now, storage has become much more viable now than it was 10 years ago. But for example, there's no real regulatory framework that might have changed recently, but I think that still isn't for battery storage. So like if you're a company, you do battery storage, until you settle this, you might be paying charges twice, once to receive and once to dispatch energy. The EU settled this a couple of years ago and said they're treating them like energy producers. So they're treated like a producer, which is a more favorable regime that allows them to like develop and as an industry.
I see.
If that
Well,
makes sense.
uh, uh, maybe we had a bit of I feel like our questions may have taken a bit of a negative slant unnecessarily or unwillingly. So I do want to mention, obviously, as you said, Japan's done a lot of great work. Is there any final, as we're coming to a conclusion here, is there any final words you'd like to have, or any talk about maybe the future potential that Japan has in this realm before we finish today's talk?
Well, as I said, I mean, just in terms of offshore wind, Japan has the potential to become an energy exporter, actually. I mean, as the economy is more fully electrified, Japan could in the future not need fossil fuels and essentially get all of its energy from its own wind and sun and maybe geothermal. Japan has a lot of geothermal. I didn't mention that, but they have opposition from onsen owners who think that hot spring owners who think that geothermal damages their resource. That's something that has to be worked through.
Yeah, we're always going to have the interest groups. As someone who loves hot springs, I can't argue too hard about them. But yes, so that's going to pretty much take us to the end of today's talk. I want to again say thank you to Dr. Midford for taking time out of his schedule to talk to us today. If everybody can just hang by for 1 second, I'm going to put some links into the chat for some upcoming events that we have. And I'm also going to share that on the screen as well. So if folks would like to, they can come and check out our next talk in this series. Usually we have a backup person that could do this, but it's just me. So bear with me as I try to do multiple things at once. So the links are in the chat. I'm also going to share screen for some of the upcoming events that we've got coming.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Midford. And I hope everyone, well, maybe you guys are seeing the wrong version. Let me flip it over here. I hope everyone can see these upcoming events that we've got here. How's that view? All right. So we've got tomorrow in Okinawa, we've got International Relations from the Margins, Okinawa-Taiwan Relations Revisited. It's going to be at 17:30 with free refreshments. The actual seminar will start at 18:30. We have Dr. Chen from Ryokoku University. It's going to be an in-person event in Okinawa. The next event in this series of Know Japan is going to be about the traditional music of Japan. It's going to start at 10 a.m. on Tuesday the 13th. We're going to have Dr. Leonard Horton from Temple University, Japan, is going to join us for that one. And then we have two talks coming up. They're going to be looking at age and Japan's graying population. We have an in-person coming up in Tokyo, and then we will also have an in-person coming up in Sasebo. So if you're in either of those communities, please check ycaps.org for those upcoming events. And again, I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us today. That pretty much finishes us off. So have a beautiful day, have a beautiful evening, whether you're in the States or whether you're in Japan, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.